Benazir Bhutto, Chapter 8, Page number 61. The lifting of martial law on December 30, 1985 was effected with fanfare, but as Bhutto noted, the change of government was mostly cosmetic. Zia was still president and army chief of staff, despite his civilian uniform. He had also pushed through a constitutional amendment that indemnified the regime not only for actions taken under martial law but also for actions that might yet be taken under the remaining months of martial law. Bhutto had returned to Europe after her spell of detention, but she now began to consider a permanent return to Pakistan. If she was arrested on arrival, it would prove the hollowness of Zia's promises. If not, she could begin a serious political agitation, organizing mass demonstrations to pressure Zia into holding elections. She was nervous about returning and she had every reason to be. She was regularly receiving threats on her life, with allies who were in touch with the military warning her that she might well be assassinated on her return. She also feared the CIA, for Zia was still very much Washington's man. She remembered the fate of Benigno Aquino, gunned down on his arrival at Manila airport 2 years previously. After 3 years of exile, it was Corazon Aquino, the feisty woman who had taken on her family's mantle of leadership against a hated dictator, with whom Bhutto wished to be identified, not the ill-fated Benigno. Preparing for a return to the struggle, she began a tour for the purpose of placating powers, both worldly and supernatural, to Washington to Mecca, where she performed the Muslim Umrah to the Soviet Union so as not to be accused by leftist members of running too far toward the United States and back to London, where she was greeted by a host of reporters wanting to know more about her announced departure for Pakistan. On April 10, by now she had become a master of Western-style PR, and as she noted with some satisfaction, the press enjoyed seeing her political challenge as a dramatic and poignant confrontation between a young woman and a military dictator, a modern and feminist version of David and Goliath. After 8 years of autocratic theocracy, pro-democracy, Pakistanis were desperate for a change, and when Bhutto arrived at Lahore, they turned out to greet her in numbers that were unprecedented even in that city's volatile history. She never forgot the feeling and would spend the rest of her life trying to regain it. There are moments in life which are not possible to describe, Bhutto wrote in her autobiography. My return to Lahore was one of them. The sea of humanity lining the roads, jammed on balconies and roofs, wedged in trees and on lamp posts, walking alongside the truck and stretching back across the fields, was more like an ocean. The 8-mile drive from the airport to the Minar-e Pakistan in Iqbal Park usually takes 15 minutes. On the unbelievable day of April 10, 1986, it took us 10 hours. The figure of 1 million people at the airport grew to 2 million, then 3 million by the time we reached the Minar-e Pakistan. Hundreds of colored balloons soared into the sky as the airport gates opened. Rose petals, not tear gas, filled the air, showering onto the truck until they rose above my ankles. Garlands of flowers flew through the air. I saw a girl whose father had been hanged and threw a garland to her. More garlands were thrown onto the truck, as were hundreds of handmade dupattas and shawls. I put one dupatta after another on my head and slung others on my shoulders. Later in life, Benazir would be accused of having become addicted to power. It might be more correct to say that she became addicted to adoration, and if so, this return to Pakistan was a key moment in the process. It is difficult for Westerners to comprehend the sheer magnitude of public display and participation that marked the continental political process. The surging crowds, the hysterical chanting and shouting, and the dancing, the swaying, the jumping on cars. Many of us have seen footage of Mahatma Gandhi's famous salt marches, an impressive enough sight. Since that time, the numbers in South Asian crowds have grown exponentially, while the decorum of the Raj era has turned into frenzied ecstasy. Political rallies are openly referred to as tamasas, shows, and politicians round up enormous crowds, sometimes by main force, to give the appearance of mass support. When the reality is lacking, Indira Gandhi was especially famous for this. Banerjee rubbed it all. She played the crowd masterfully and drew inspiration and sustenance from its palpable love. 2 days after her arrival, she and her entourage set out on a tour of Punjab, visiting 19 cities, including Jairam, none other city of soldiers, for the many men it had provided to the army, and Rawalpindi, home of the army general headquarters and place of her father's execution. Everywhere they were accorded the same aesthetic reception to the disgust of the regime, which mandated that films and photographs of the rallies not be disseminated in the official press and that Bhutto's image not appear on Pakistani television. The group then proceeded to Peshawar, near the Khyber Pass in the northwest frontier province, the center for Afghan Mujahideen activity in Pakistan, and the place where many of Pakistan's 3 million Afghan refugees were living. Then on to the Balochistan. The sheer numbers of PPP supporters all over the country were so great that Bhutto's enemies in the regime not dare interfere with her activities. But other PPP activists were harassed, arrested, even shot down. Back in Karachi, Bhutto and the PPP re-established their alliance with the movement for the restoration of democracy. Solidarity was vital if they were to have any chance against jail. The group more or less united, though the leaders of several other parties resented Bhutto's easy assumption that she would be the MRD's figurehead in the big cities on Independence Day, August 14, and pressed again for September elections. In the lead up to August 14, anticipation built with the foreign press flooding into Karachi. Bhutto's old Elliot House neighbor, the writer Annie Freddyman, arrived on August 8 to do a piece for Life magazine about her friend's return to Pakistan, accompanied by photographer Mary Ellen Mark. The two Americans looked on in astonishment at preparation for coming battle swirled around them. Her phones were tapped. Freddyman remembered a truck belonging to Pakistan's Central Intelligence Agency was routinely parked outside her gate. Opposition workers and protesters were being arrested and beaten by the thousand. Banerjee, undaunted and even excited, prepared for the day of protest. She was planning to lead a car procession from Faisalabad to Lahore, but she was greeted at the Karachi airport with a restraining order forbidding her to travel to those cities. Undaunted, she returned to 70 Clifton, and on the big day, August 14, she and her entourage, which now included Freddyman and Mark, set out for the rally in two vans with sunroofs. Carrying through the Karachi streets, where supporters in their thousands shouted, waved flags, and pressed against the car, shaking it. Young men pressed bleeding bounds against the car windows, showing her that they had been beaten by the police. Mary Ellen Mark recalled Banerjee as a daredevil. She loved the excitement of crowds and danger. She climbed up to stand through the sunroof, and she stood there like the Statue of Liberty, just like a big heroic statue. She was very brave, determined. She lived for that kind of excitement. She really had a sense of what a superstar is. As the vehicle made their slow way through the crowd, the police fired on them, with tear gas cells. Miraculously, the bands managed to evade their uninvited escort long enough to tour the poorer neighborhoods. Though at one point Bhutto had super surreptitiously to change cars. When the group reached 70 Clifton that evening, the police were there with a warrant to arrest Bhutto, who was charged with unlawful assembly and sentenced to 30 days in prison. Waving at the crowds, she got into the police car and headed off to solitary confinement in Randi jail, still smiling radiantly. Mark's photographs, which were published in Life soon afterward, show a glowing, joyful-looking woman. She was clearly loved every minute of the chase. Jia disclaimed any knowledge of Bhutto's arrest, saying that the Prime Minister, Muhammad Khan Juneja, had been in charge of the police action, but he affirmed his approval, even stating his opinion that Bhutto had received financial backing from foreign governments, especially the USSR, for his overthrow. Bhutto's allies in the US Senate, handpicked by Peter Galbraith and Claiborne Pell, expressed outrage at her incarceration. But President Reagan offered congratulations to Jia on the steps he was taking toward democracy. Bhutto's trial revealed that she had committed no illegal act, and the groundswell of support for her inside and outside the country made the administration consider it unwise to keep her incarcerated. Released on September 9, she toured the country again, and the threats against her life and attacks on her supporters continued. On MRD leader was axed to death, and in January there was an assassination attempt against Bhutto herself when her car was shot at on the road to Larkana. Bhutto was not in the car. Unbeknownst to her would-be assassins, she had opted that day to travel by air. If she aspired to become the leader of an Islamic nation, Benazir Bhutto was in difficult position. As her father's daughter, she had that invaluable link with a male leader, a patriarchal figure, and at least, according to her own account of the matter, he had singled her out as the most worthy child to follow in his footsteps. But this was not enough. A single woman in Pakistan simply lacked the social authority to command a nation husbandless. Bhutto faced only the shakiest political future. There was also the question of her image as practicing Muslim, far more important for a woman who hoped to achieve high office in Pakistan than for a man. Her friend Kathleen Drucker remembers her saying that in our religion there is an obligation to marry and have children. This seemed very ambiguous, comments Drucker. Did she mean that she herself believed it, or that it was a political necessity? Bhutto was now in her 30s, and while she had never shown any aversion to handsome men, her friends at Oxford and Harvard agree on this fact. She had sublimated matrimonial notions to her political struggle. There had been no place for a man in her life until this moment, in fact insane. His woman, a graph about Pakistan, Salman Rushdie had dubbed the character based on Benazir, the Virgin Iron Pants, now with real power in sight. A fiancé became the indispensable object. But now to get hold of the right one. Her reflections on the conundrum here given in an interview with the New York Times magazine in 1994 are unusually honest. I could not have a love match. I was under so much scrutiny. If my name had been linked with a man, it would have destroyed my political career. Actually, I had reconciled myself to a life without marriage or children for the sake of my career. And then my brothers got married. I realized I did not even have a home, that in the future I could not do politics when I had to ask permissions from their wives to whether I could use the dining room or the telephone. I could not rent a home because a woman living on her own can be suspected of all kinds of scandals association. So keeping in mind that many people in Pakistan looked to me I decided to make a personal sacrifice in what I thought would be, more or less, a loveless marriage, a marriage of convenience. The surprising thing is that we are very close and that it's been a very good match. The traditional arranged marriage was an event that was normal for most Pakistanis, but did not quite fit the progressive, liberated image of the Bhutto family. Zulfikar and Nusrat, after all, had married for love and against the wishes of the Bhutto clan. But perhaps in Pakistan, it was more difficult for a woman like Benazir to flaunt her independence by choosing her own partner than it would have been for a man like her father, men, after all, were acknowledged as the masters of their own fates. Keeping this in mind, an arranged marriage might have been not only the simplest solution to her problem, but the most political savvy as well. In any case, she seems to have felt the need to defend her decision to have an arranged marriage, particularly to Western observers, for she knew how important it was that she be perceived in Europe and America as the progressive, liberal face of the Muslim world. People today do computer dating, she argued. Is that a betrayal? When it is difficult to find a man for whatever reason, one has to look for mediation. I did love to arrange my own children's marriages. I say that because I have been so happy. All this is easy enough to explain, but what is not so easy to comprehend. In retrospect, is the choice of Asif Ali Zardari for the male lead in this latest act of family drama. Socially and professionally, he was not a match for her. The Zardaris were a land-owning family, but on a smaller scale than the Bhuttos. Asif's father had made a substantial fortune in construction. He also owned movie theaters in Karachi. Asif himself was good-looking, a passionate polo player, and reputed to be an almost equally enthusiastic womanizer. His education could not compare with Benazir's. He had attended a military cadet college near Hyderabad that catered to the sons of the rich, and had put in a few months at a commercial college in London. Though upon the couple's engagement, it was put about in the press that he had attended the London School of Economics. I have no interest in politics, he informed the press, and this appears to have been a sincere statement at that time. Zardari had positive qualities that seemed to balance his lack of substance. Everyone remarked on his warmth. He was a kind man, genuinely friendly and concerned, socially adept, easygoing, light-hearted. In many ways, he appeared the ideal political spouse, for at gathering, he could play the room, filling glasses and cracking jokes, making every guest feel cared for. While his wife got on with business, he was also a singularly devoted father, an important quality for the husband of a powerful woman, always on the move, and he had courage to marry into the Bhutto family, the archnemesis of the military dictator was a very brave act, and Zardari was to pay dearly for it as well as to reap enormous benefits. As Benazir's friend Christina Lamb, a British journalist who covered Pakistan at the time, noted, wedding in Pakistan are a matter of face. Combine that with Benazir's fanatical perfectionism and you have a recipe for high tension. Conscious that her every action at this time had a potential political significance, Benazir walked a fine line between tradition and progressivism. In traditional arranged marriage, the bride was not offered the opportunity to meet the groom before the marriage, but Benazir and Asif had met and approved each other before the match was agreed on. I did meet him, Benazir informed the New York Times, and because I felt he is nice and had a sense of humor, and he seemed to be a tolerant person in that he could handle having a wife who had an independent career of her own. I thought it was wise to accept the proposal. Nevertheless, she confirmed to the tradition that throughout the year of family negotiations over the match and the months of preparation leading up to the wedding, she and Asif could not spend a single moment alone together. Another change in tradition was Benazir's request that Nusrat forego giving the customary dowry. The Jardaris would be receiving no rich prizes from the Bhuttos except for Benazir herself, a lucrative prize enough to be sure, for Benazir would immediately bestows on her new husband the PPP ticket for the Riyari seat, center of the Bhutto's Karachi power base, and the first step in Jardari's own inexorable rise to power and self-investment. She also radically cut down on the usual trousseau. Instead of 21 to 51 sets of clothes usually presented to the bride, Lamb reports she had set the limit at only two. Instead of gold bangles all the way up each arm, she said she would wear glass, explaining, I am a leader, I must set an example to my pupil. Nor she said, did she have time for the traditional beaks parda? Instead, she kept nipping out to the office. More importantly, she decided to keep her maiden name Benazir Bhutto does not cease to exist the moment she gets married. She insisted, I am not giving myself away. I belong to myself and I always shall. This bold feminist gesture worked, of course, very much to her own advantage. For it would have been political folly to give up the magic name of Bhutto. Wedding invitations were mailed from Dubai rather than Pakistan. Reached the Jia Vizier, confiscated them. Annie Fadiman, who arrived from America to attend her friend's wedding and cover it for life, found herself surprised and touched that she prepared for her wedding. Benazir permitted herself to be unequivocally feminine for the first time in years. She took considerable pleasure in having her hair and nails done. She experimented each day with different shades of eye makeup and she geared a lot, just the way she used to do when she was 17. Every evening the Bhutto women and their female friends donned brightly colored salwar kameez and danced. In preparation for the Mehndi, the evening of music and dance that would take place on the eve of the wedding, Benazir's Western guests agreed that they felt like brave little caterpillars surrounded by butterflies. The atmosphere at 70 Clifton was a gaudy, fabulous, sentimental scene. During the Mehndi, Benazir and Jardari sat on a double throne under a steady rain of rose petals. At the actual exchange of bows, the nikah, they sat on a dais covered by a veil. A silver mirror was placed between them so that when the veil was removed, Asif would be the first to see his bride's downcast, reflected face. The ceremony took place in the garden at 70 Clifton before a surprisingly small group of family and friends, about 100 by one estimation. Benazir was excited. Remembers Yolanda Kodraki. There was a chaotic situation afterward, a big move scene with photographers posing to get in. After that, the celebration went public with a nighttime party at an enormous sports field in the poor Karachi slum neighborhood of Riyari, where crowds approached 200,000 and the revelry grew riotous, with youthful PPP supporters storming the stage and shooting off Kalashnikovs into the air. The gunfire killed one bystander and injured more than 50. Just how happy a marriage Bhutto and Jardari enjoyed will probably never be known. Rigorously protective of her image, Bhutto always projected support and loyalty for her unpopular mate. Of their 20 years as a couple, Jardari spent a total of 10 in prison. The two were only infrequently together for the last few years of Bhutto's life. Even after Jardari's final release from prison in 2004, the couple lived apart, and a number of their friends confided to the press that the marriage was effectively over. But whatever the state of their personal relationship, there can be no doubt that the two of them worked together as a team throughout their 2 decades in and out of power. Bhutto, of course, had little choice in the matter. Divorce or any open breach would probably have spelled the end of her political career. A Pakistani woman will endure almost anything in order to hold a marriage together. Bhutto's associate Tahmina Durrani had said, in our society, marriage may be purgatory, but divorce is hell. Thank you very much for listening. This is the end of page number 68, chapter number 8.